The paper sat on Marshal Cade Ellison's desk like a loaded gun, and Olive Osborne read every word of it with shaking hands. Petition for adoption of one minor child, Thomas Osborne, age 4. She had come to Dustfall, Texas, to collect her nephew after her brother's murder, to take the boy home to her sister's farm in Kansas, to grieve quietly and move on. She had not come to find her name crossed out and replaced with the Marshal's bold, slanted signature. She had not come to discover that this hard-edged man with the badge pinned to his chest had already filed the paperwork, already spoken to Judge Harlan, already arranged for Tommy to stay right here in this town while she was made to feel like a guest in her own family's crisis. "You did this without asking me," she said, and her voice was dangerously quiet. Cade Ellison stood with his back to her, staring out the single window of his office at the main street of Dustfall, where the October dust blew in long orange curtains between the buildings. He was tall, broader across the shoulders than seemed quite necessary, and he wore his silence like a second badge. "I asked Judge Harlan," he said. "He is not Tommy's family. I am Tommy's family." Cade turned then, and Olive felt the full weight of his gaze for the first time, dark gray eyes under a straight brow, a jaw that had not softened once in the 31 years she suspected he had been alive. There was something in his face she could not immediately name. Not cruelty. Something harder than cruelty and more complicated. "You plan to take that boy to Kansas in November," he said, "on a stage that crosses the Cimarron Crossing, past 3 outlaw territories with a price still sitting on your brother's name. The price is on Marcus's name. Marcus is dead. Outlaw gangs don't always know the difference between a dead man and his kin." She laid the paper down on his desk with great care, because she did not trust herself to throw it. "This is not your decision to make, Marshal Ellison. And I promise you, I will be back in this office tomorrow with a lawyer and a letter from my sister, and we will undo every word of what you have done here." He did not flinch. He said nothing at all. She walked out into the October dust, and it was only when she was halfway down the street, past the feed store and the barber and the woman hanging laundry from a second-floor window, that she realized her hands were still shaking, and she did not know, with any certainty, whether it was from rage or from the slow, creeping recognition that some part of what the Marshal said was true. The Cimarron Crossing in November was no small thing, and the men who had killed her brother Marcus had not yet been caught. It had begun 6 weeks before that confrontation, in late September of 1883, when the telegram reached Olive at her position as a schoolteacher in the small farming community of Holt, Kansas. She taught reading and arithmetic to 23 children between the ages of 6 and 12, in a single-room schoolhouse on the edge of a wheat field. And she had been in the middle of writing cursive letters on the chalkboard when the station master's boy knocked on the door with the folded paper. "Marcus Osborne, shot dead. 4-year-old son in custody of Dustfall Town Marshal. Come at once." She had set the chalk down. She had told the children to practice their letters. She had walked to the back corner of the room near the coat hooks and read the telegram 3 more times before she understood, in the deep and permanent way that understanding comes after loss, that her younger brother was gone. Marcus had been trouble all his life, not vicious trouble but the restless, drifting kind, the kind that took him from town to town across the territories, looking for something he could never quite name. He had married a woman named Clara in the spring of 1878, and Clara had given him Tommy before dying of fever in the summer of 1879. And after that, Marcus had carried the boy from place to place like a man unsure of where to plant his roots. Olive had sent letters. She had sent money when she could. She had begged Marcus in every way she knew to come north and settle near her and their sister Ruth. But Marcus had been the kind of man who moved toward danger the way a moth moves toward a lamp, not wanting to be burned, but unable to help himself. And now here they were. Olive had arranged a substitute teacher, borrowed $20 from her sister Ruth, and taken the southbound stage with nothing but a carpet bag and the particular grief of a woman who had been expecting bad news for years and still found it devastating when it arrived. She reached Dustfall, Texas, on a Thursday afternoon when the light was going gold and long across the flat land, and the town materialized out of the brush like a mirage that had decided to stay. It was not a large town, perhaps 400 souls, built along a single main street with the courthouse at one end and the livery at the other and everything between it that a cattle town required. There was a general store, a hotel, a doctor's office, a barber shop, a saloon, a church, and the Marshal's office, which was a square building of pale limestone with iron bars on the windows and a sign above the door that needed repainting. The hotel clerk, a slight man named Perkins with ink-stained fingers, had told her she would find Tommy at the Marshal's house, not in a cell or an orphanage as she had feared, but actually in the man's private residence on the eastern edge of town. Marshal Ellison has been looking after the boy since the shooting, Perkins said, and there was something careful in the way he said it, something that suggested there was more to the story, but that the hotel clerk did not consider it his place to tell it. She had gone to find Tommy first, before anything else, before speaking to the marshal or the judge or anyone. The Marshal's house was a single-story limestone structure with a covered porch, modest but solid, set back from the road behind a low fence and a cottonwood tree that had gone yellow with the season. A woman in an apron was sweeping the porch when Olive arrived, and she introduced herself as Mrs. Bauer, the widow who cooked and cleaned for the Marshal 3 days a week. Tommy was inside, sitting at the kitchen table with a tin cup of milk and a piece of cornbread. And when Olive came through the door, he looked up at her with Marcus's eyes, brown and wide and slightly too old for his face. And she had crossed the room in 4 steps and gathered him up and held him while he patted her back with one small hand, solemn and bewildered and smelling of soap and wood smoke. "Aunt Livy," he said, which was what he had always called her, the only version of Olive a 4-year-old could reliably produce. "I've got you," she said. "I've got you, Tommy." She had not cried yet. She did not cry then. There was something that needed to stay firm in her chest, some load-bearing wall she could not afford to take down while so much was still unresolved. She had met the Marshal later that evening, when he came home to find her still at his kitchen table, drinking the coffee Mrs. Bauer had left on the stove and watching Tommy sleep on the settle in the corner. Cade Ellison had come through the door without ceremony, set his hat on the hook with practiced precision, and stopped when he saw her. He was not what she had pictured. She had pictured someone older, harder in the visible way, the kind of man made entirely of weathered leather and distrust. He was hard, certainly, but not in a performative way. He was simply very still, very contained, the way a river is contained by its banks, and you could sense the force of the current without seeing it directly. "Miss Osborne," he said, and it was not a question. "Marshal Ellison." She stood because sitting felt wrong for what she needed to say. "I've come for my nephew." He looked at Tommy sleeping in the corner. Something moved through his expression quickly, too quickly for her to read it. "He's settled in," he said. "He's only just stopped waking in the night. He will settle again with me." Cade had not argued further that evening. He had been civil, even quiet in a way that was almost courteous, had offered her a second cup of coffee, had answered her questions about Marcus's death with careful brevity. Marcus had been shot outside the Dustfall saloon by a man named Cord Haverson, who rode with a loose outfit of cattle thieves and worse that operated between the Panhandle and the Indian Territory. There had been a dispute about money, from what the witnesses said. Haverson was in the wind. The case was ongoing. She had thanked him, returned to the hotel, and spent the night not sleeping, turning over the problem of Tommy and the problem of November and the problem of Cord Haverson like stones in a river, finding nothing smooth beneath any of them. And then the next morning, she had gone to the Marshal's office to discuss arrangements and found the adoption petition on his desk. The lawyer in Dustfall was a man named Hargrove, and he received Olive in his small office above the hardware store on a Friday morning with the professional sympathy of a man who had delivered bad news to women many times and had grown efficient if not warm about it. "The petition has been filed," Hargrove said, "but it has not been finalized. Judge Harlan has a 60-day review period." "Good. Then there is time to contest it." Hargrove pressed his fingertips together. "Miss Osborne, as the biological aunt, you have a strong claim. The Marshal is aware of that, I believe. However, there are complicating factors, such as your current situation, forgive me, a single woman of 25 employed as a schoolteacher, renting a room from your sister's family. You have no husband, no property of your own, no established household that could be submitted as evidence of stability. I have stability of character, which is what a child needs." "Yes," Hargrove said, and he sounded like he meant it. "But the law cares more about circumstance than character, I am afraid. Marshal Ellison, on the other hand, is a landowner, a man of established reputation, appointed by the county, known to the judge personally." "Known to the judge personally," Olive repeated. "Is that a polite way of saying they are friends?" "It is a polite way of saying that they are friends," Hargrove agreed. She walked back out into the street with the distinct feeling that the town of Dustfall had been arranged against her in some way she could not yet fully see. The feeling was not paranoia. It was pattern recognition, the accumulated experience of a woman who had learned that the world was not built to make things easy for women who tried to claim what was rightfully theirs. She spent 2 more days in Dustfall before she spoke to Cade Ellison again. And in those 2 days, she existed in the uncomfortable position of needing to be near Tommy, who was at the Marshal's house, and therefore needing to be near the Marshal, who had betrayed her trust before she even knew him well enough to trust. Mrs. Bauer was generous about letting her come and spend the days with Tommy, and Tommy, for his part, seemed to occupy both worlds with the adaptability of very young children in disrupted circumstances, clinging to Olive when she was there and apparently managing adequately when she was not. He had a toy horse made of carved wood that the Marshal had given him, and he carried it everywhere, and the sight of it caused Olive a complicated feeling she did not examine too carefully. On the 3rd day after the confrontation at the Marshal's office, Cade Ellison came home in the middle of the afternoon, while Olive was on the porch reading to Tommy from a thin book of illustrated fables she had brought from Kansas. He stood at the gate for a moment watching them before he came through. "Miss Osborne," he said, "do you have a few minutes?" It was phrased like a question but delivered like a statement. She closed the book. "Tommy, go inside and finish your milk." Tommy went, dragging the carved horse behind him. Cade sat down in the other porch chair with the deliberateness of a man who did not sit often and found it slightly uncomfortable. He rested his forearms on his knees and looked at the cottonwood tree for a moment. "I want to explain the petition," he said. "I have been waiting for you to." He was quiet for a moment longer. When he spoke, his voice had dropped slightly, lost some of the official flatness it carried when he was being the Marshal rather than a person. "Cord Haverson's outfit, the men who killed Marcus. They are not finished with the Osborne name. I have reason to believe, from a contact I have in the territory, that Haverson believes Marcus had something. Money or something of value that Haverson thinks he was cheated out of. Did Marcus have anything like that? I don't know. Maybe. Maybe he didn't, but Haverson believes he did, and there is no difference between the two from a practical standpoint. He turned to look at her then. If you take Tommy north in November, you will be traveling with a child whose last name is Osborne through country where Haverson has people. That is not a theoretical risk. That is a specific danger. Olive looked at the yellow cottonwood. A leaf detached and drifted. You could have told me this instead of filing papers behind my back. I could have, he said. That was wrong. I acted before I thought it through properly. She had not expected the admission. It disarmed her in a way that irritated her, because she would have preferred to go on being simply angry. Why did you act at all? You are the town marshal, not Tommy's father. He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough that she turned to look at him. His jaw was set, his eyes on the middle distance. I was on duty the night Marcus was shot, he said finally. I was at the other end of town. If I had been 2 streets closer, I might have stopped it. Or you might not have, or I might not have. But I was not there, and Marcus died on the street outside the saloon, and Tommy was sitting inside waiting for his father to come back. He stopped. I carried the boy home myself. He didn't cry. He just held onto my collar. He did not let go for a long time. Olive breathed slowly. She was not going to soften entirely. She was not going to let guilt, his or her own, become the architecture of decisions that needed to be made carefully. But she heard the truth in what he was saying. What exactly are you proposing? She said. Stay in Dustfall through the winter. Let me get Haverson in custody before you take the boy anywhere. Come spring, if the danger is resolved, I will withdraw the petition myself, and you can take Tommy to Kansas with my blessing and a letter of introduction to every lawman between here and the border. And if you do not catch Haverson by spring, then we reassess. She looked at him for a long time. He met her gaze without flinching, and the directness of it was somehow more convincing than any elaborate assurance could have been. This was not a man who made promises he was confident he couldn't keep. I would need to send word to Kansas, she said. Arrange for someone to take over the school until I return. The telegraph office is open until 6. She stood up, smoothing the front of her dress. I will stay through the winter, Marshal Ellison, not because of the petition, because Tommy is here and I will not leave him regardless. But if Haverson is caught and the danger is resolved, the petition goes away entirely. We agree on that now in front of witnesses if necessary. In front of witnesses if necessary, he said. She went inside to check on Tommy, and she did not look back. But she was aware of Cade Ellison sitting on the porch for another few minutes before she heard the chair creak and his boots move toward the door. And she was aware, in a way she did not particularly welcome, that something in the quality of the afternoon had shifted. The days that followed had a strange domestic rhythm that Olive had not anticipated. She could not stay at the Marshal's house, obviously, but she spent the daylight hours there with Tommy, helping Mrs. Bauer with meals, reading to the boy, teaching him his letters the way she taught the children in Kansas, with patience and repetition and small celebrations over each new word he recognized. The hotel was $3 a week, which was more than she had expected, and Hargrove had mentioned, with the professional delicacy she was beginning to recognize as his particular gift, that Dustfall's school had only a part-time teacher through the winter session, and that the school board would likely welcome a qualified instructor if she were interested in earning a wage while she stayed. She was interested. She went to speak with the school board, which consisted of 3 men and the banker's wife, and they hired her for the winter session at $8 a month, which was somewhat less than Kansas but enough to keep her independent, which was what mattered. She liked the children of Dustfall. They were the children of cattle ranchers and shopkeepers, and a few Mexican families who had been in the territory longer than the town itself. And they were curious and unruly and wonderful in the specific way children always were when you paid them genuine attention. She settled into the rhythm of the classroom with the comfort of someone returning to a task they were built for. And gradually, slowly, in the way that things happen when you are not watching for them, she began to know Cade Ellison. It happened mostly in the evenings, when she came to collect Tommy for his supper before walking him back to the Marshal's house after his bedtime, and Cade would sometimes be on the porch, or sometimes in the kitchen, and they would speak for 15 or 20 minutes about small things, the day's weather, something Tommy had done, a new family that had arrived in town. She learned that he had grown up in Missouri, the son of a farmer who had died in the war in 1863, leaving Cade and his mother and 2 younger brothers to manage. She learned that he had come to Texas at 19, worked cattle for several years, and eventually drifted into law work the way some men drifted into it, through a combination of competence, necessity, and the inability to look the other way when he saw something wrong. She learned that he read. This surprised her more than it probably should have. He had a shelf of books in the front room, proper books, not just almanacs and legal texts, Dickens and Shakespeare, and a worn copy of A Natural History. He said he had bought secondhand in San Antonio and carried for 4 years. The Natural History had notes in the margins in a small, precise hand. "You annotate your books," she said one evening, holding the volume with its careful marginalia. "I think better when I write," he said, from the doorway between the kitchen and the front room. "So do I," she said, and looked up and found him watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something open and slightly unguarded, gone so quickly she was not entirely sure she had seen it at all. Tommy was asleep in the small room at the back of the house that had become, in the months since his father's death, entirely and unmistakably his, with his carved horse on the windowsill, and a drawing Olive had made of a dog pinned to the wall, and a small quilt that Mrs. Bauer had contributed from somewhere in her capacious domestic resources. Olive walked back to the hotel that night through the cold dark of a late October evening in Dustfall, and she thought about the expression on Cade Ellison's face when she had looked up from the Natural History, and she told herself firmly that it did not mean anything, and she was only partially successful. November arrived with cold wind and thin gray clouds that pressed down on the land like a lid. Olive received a letter from her sister Ruth, who wrote in the warm, practical way of a woman who had made peace with the world through hard work and good humor. Ruth said the substitute teacher was managing adequately, that the wheat was in, that she was glad Olive was safe and warm, and that she trusted her to handle the situation with good judgment. "She trusts you," Olive said to Tommy, reading a portion of the letter aloud in simplified form, "and she sends you a kiss and says there is a dog at the farm she thinks you would like." "Does it have spots?" Tommy said. "She does not say about the spots. I will ask." From Cade, that same week, she learned that his contact in the territory had sent word that Haverson and his remaining men were wintering somewhere in the Panhandle. No specific location. Still out of reach, but tracked, watched, the net slowly being drawn. "How long does something like this typically take?" she asked. They were in the kitchen. Mrs. Bauer had gone home. Tommy was asleep. Cade was cleaning his revolver at the table with the methodical care of a man for whom the maintenance of tools was a form of discipline, and Olive was hemming a dress for a child in her class whose mother had been ill and could not see to it herself. "It takes as long as it takes," he said. "Men like Haverson make mistakes eventually. They always do. They spend too much, or they drink too much, or they trust the wrong person. And until then, I keep watching." He looked up from the revolver. "You are not in danger here, Miss Osborne, not in Dustfall. I would know." She believed him. That was the troubling part. He was not reassuring in an easy way, not trying to smooth her worry with comfortable words. When he said he would know, he meant it with the specific confidence of a man who had built his reliability from the ground up over many years, and she found that she trusted it. She did not entirely want to trust it. Trust was a thing she had learned to extend carefully, after a childhood that included a father who had been well-meaning but unreliable, after Marcus, after a man in Kansas 2 years ago who had been charming and attentive, and then vanished the moment. She suggested that whatever was between them might become something permanent. "You do not give reassurance easily," she said. "No," he agreed, "neither do I." He set the revolver down, looked at her. "I know that about you," he said. "It is one of the things I respect." The room was warm. The oil lamp threw a steady light. Olive's needle went through the fabric and through, and she thought about what he had just said, the careful way he had said it, and she did not respond because she did not know how to respond to something so plainly and quietly true. The weeks passed. The winter settled in. Olive fell into a life she had not planned and found, in the falling, that it fit her better than she was prepared to admit. She taught school from 8 until 3. She spent her afternoons with Tommy. She ate supper, increasingly often at the Marshal's table, because Mrs. Bauer had begun cooking as though Olive were a permanent resident, and it seemed rude to refuse. She walked home in the cold dark and told herself she was managing a difficult situation with appropriate practicality, and not, absolutely not, beginning to look forward to the evenings at the limestone house with a feeling that had no practical business being there. She was 25 years old. She had a life in Kansas. She had a schoolhouse and a sister and a future that she had constructed carefully with her own hands. She was not going to abandon it for a man she had known for 6 weeks. It was one of her children at school, a girl named Bessie Crane, who put the entire situation into words simpler and more accurate than Olive's own interior monologue had managed. "My pa says you are sweet on the Marshal," Bessie said, with the cheerful savagery of an 8-year-old. "Your father," Olive said, "should attend to his own affairs." But she spent the walk home that afternoon reviewing the evidence with the honest attention of a woman who prided herself on not lying to herself, and the evidence was not encouraging, if encouraging meant what she wanted it to mean. She thought about Cade too often. She noticed things about him that she had no particular reason to notice. The way he moved through a room, careful and economical. The way he was with Tommy, not demonstratively warm. He was not a demonstratively warm man, but steady, reliable, showing up in the same way every day, which for a child who had lost everything was perhaps the most valuable thing. She had noticed, too, that he did not treat her like a problem to be managed. After the initial disaster of the petition, which she could see more clearly now as an act of misguided protection rather than deliberate manipulation, he had been scrupulous about including her in every decision that touched Tommy's life. When the doctor had come in November to check on Tommy's persistent cough, Cade had sent for Olive before the appointment, not after. When the school board had asked whether Olive might continue teaching in the spring, Cade had brought her the news directly rather than allowing her to hear it secondhand. He was not easy to know. He did not offer information about himself readily, and there were entire territories of his interior life that she could sense but not see. dark rooms behind closed doors. She had learned not to push. She had learned to ask sideways questions and wait, and sometimes he would open a door slowly, and she would see something through it. The night she saw the most was a Thursday in late November, when a hard rain was coming down outside and Tommy had a bad dream and woke screaming in a way that took both of them. Cade from the front room and Olive from the kitchen where she had been washing up, into his room simultaneously, and they had stood on either side of his small bed while he calmed down, both of them speaking quietly in the particular register adults use for frightened children. "It was the dark man again," Tommy said, meaning they both understood, the night his father died, the shape of violence he had glimpsed through a window or a door or in the street before someone had the sense to take him inside. Olive took his hand. Cade sat on the edge of the bed, and it was the first time she had seen him touch the boy voluntarily rather than in response to Tommy's own reaching, and the care with which he did it. The particular gentleness of a man who was not practiced in gentleness caught her in the chest like a fist. "The dark man is not here," Cade said. "I will not let him in." Tommy looked up at him with the total credulous trust of a 4-year-old who had decided a person was safe. "Promise." "I promise," Cade said. Tommy fell asleep again within minutes, and they both stayed a little longer than necessary, and then stepped quietly back into the hallway. And in the hallway, in the dim light with the rain on the roof, Olive looked at Cade and found him looking back at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment that lasted entirely too long to be accidental. "He is going to be all right," Olive said finally, because she needed to say something. "Yes," Cade said. "He is." She went home through the rain with her coat pulled close and her mind going in directions she was not yet ready to follow all the way to their conclusions. December came in ice and cold blue skies, and with it, news from the territory that changed everything. Haverson had been spotted in a town called Ridgeline, 40 miles southeast of Dustfall, with 4 of his men. The contact sent word via a rider who arrived at the Marshal's office on a Tuesday morning in the first week of the month. Cade told Olive that evening, and his face had the focused quality she was beginning to recognize as the Marshal version of him, the one that was all forward motion and calculated decisions. "I am going to Ridgeline," he said. "When?" "Tomorrow morning. I have already sent word to the county sheriff. He is sending 2 deputies to meet me." "How long will you be gone?" 3 days at most. I want you to stay here while I am gone, not at the hotel. Mrs. Bauer will be here." She almost argued. She had her own opinions about where she slept and under whose roof. But she looked at Tommy, who was in the front room arranging small stones he had collected into rows on the floor, and she said, "All right." He left before dawn, and she heard the horse on the frozen ground from the window of the small room she was now occupying, the one behind the kitchen, and she lay awake for an hour afterward listening to the cold silence. The 3 days were the longest of her time in Dustfall. She taught her classes. She spent her evenings with Tommy. She talked to Mrs. Bauer, who turned out to be a remarkable woman with strong opinions about frontier cooking and a past that included 2 previous marriages, one to a man who had died of a snake bite and one to a man who had been simply unbearable and had eventually left of his own accord, which she considered the best possible outcome. "Do you think the Marshal is all right?" Olive asked on the evening of the second day. Mrs. Bauer, who was rolling pastry with the authority of someone who considered it a moral activity, glanced at her sidelong. "He generally is," she said. "He is careful. He seems careful." "He is," Mrs. Bauer said, "and he is considerably less reckless than he used to be." This was such an interesting sentence that Olive had to pursue it. "What was he like before?" "Harder," Mrs. Bauer said, folding the pastry with precision. "After his deputy was killed 4 years ago." He and Hal Greer came up together, rode together for 3 years. Greer took a bullet that was probably meant for Cade, and he took it very badly. Spent about a year being the kind of man you keep your distance from. Worked himself nearly to death and drank more than was good for him and wouldn't let anyone close enough to matter. What changed? Mrs. Bauer shrugged, trimmed the edge of the pastry. Time, mostly. And something shifts in a man when he stops wanting to punish himself and starts wanting to be worth something instead. She glanced up. He is worth something, Miss Osborne. I believe that. Whatever brought him to file that fool petition, it was not a bad heart that did it. Olive was quiet for a moment. I know, she said finally. I know it was not. Cade came back on the morning of the 4th day, not the 3rd, and she heard the horse again and was out the door and on the porch before she had fully decided to be. And she watched him come through the gate with 3 other men, and the specific exhausted precision of someone who had been awake too long. And she felt a relief so immediate and physical that it briefly frightened her. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. You got him, she said, reading it in his face. We got him, he said. Haverson is in the county jail at Ridgeline. He will be tried in February. She breathed. She pressed her hand briefly to her sternum as though she could hold the relief steady there. Tommy is still asleep, she said. Good, he said, and he came up the steps, and he was close, closer than he had stood to her before, and she could see the exhaustion in the lines around his eyes and the dust of hard riding still on his coat, and she did something then that she had not planned and could not entirely account for. She reached up and briefly touched his jaw with her fingertips, just the briefest contact, barely there. He went still. She dropped her hand. I am glad you are back, she said, with a steadiness she did not entirely feel. So am I, he said quietly. She went inside to make coffee, and neither of them mentioned it. And the thing between them, which had been building so gradually that she had been able to pretend for weeks it was not building at all, was now quite plainly and undeniably there. Christmas came. It was Olive's first Christmas away from Ruth and the farm, and she felt that absence like a stone in her pocket, present and weighty. But the children at school made a pageant, and Tommy was a shepherd in the nativity with a dish towel on his head, and the carved horse held out like an offering, and Dustfall's small church was warm and lit with candles, and Mrs. Bauer made a Christmas dinner of such ambition and competence that even Cade, who ate everything with the same practical efficiency, paused at one point and said she had outdone herself. After supper, after Tommy was asleep and Mrs. Bauer had gone to her own home, Olive and Cade sat in the front room by the stove, and Olive read from a book she had borrowed from the church library, and Cade worked through a stack of papers from the county office, and the room was warm and quiet, and outside the Christmas dark lay over Dustfall like a calm. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes, he said, without looking up from the papers. When you filed the petition, you said it was to keep Tommy safe from Haverson. That is true. Is it the whole truth? The papers stopped moving. He looked up. She met his eyes. He was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him deciding something. No, he said. Not entirely. She waited. You came into this town, he said slowly, working toward the words with the visible effort of a man unused to saying things out loud that he had only ever thought. And I had already spent 6 weeks trying to hold things together for that boy without knowing what to do with him, past getting him fed and sleeping without screaming. And you walked in and you knew exactly what to do. You sat down and you talked to him like he was a real person and not a problem, and he followed you around the kitchen for the rest of the day. She waited. And I knew The moment I saw that you were going to take him and leave, and the right thing was to let you because you are his family and I am nothing to either of you. But I filed the papers instead." He stopped. "It was wrong. I know it was wrong. I could tell you I did it purely for his safety and there would be truth in it, but it would not be the whole truth." "Why did you want me to stay?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "Because I did not want you to leave." She set the book down carefully. The stove ticked. Outside, somewhere in the dark, an owl spoke once and was answered. "Cade," she said, and she had not called him by his name before, and the sound of it in the room was different than she expected, more weight to it, more consequence. "I am aware," he said, "that this is a bad position for me to be in. You are Tommy's aunt. You should be making this decision freely, not because I have made it difficult for you to leave. I am going to withdraw the petition after the new year regardless." "I should have withdrawn it the moment I explained the danger and you agreed to stay." "Yes," she said, "you should have. I am telling you now because I would rather say the uncomfortable thing than let you think the only reason I wanted you to stay was the legal document." She looked at him for a long time. The firelight moved across the planes of his face, and she thought about what Mrs. Bauer had said about the man who had stopped wanting to punish himself and started wanting to be worth something. And she thought about the way he had sat on Tommy's bed in the dark and made a promise. And she thought about his hand still on the papers and his eyes on her, and the particular quality of a person who is telling you the truth at some cost to themselves. "I did not want to come to Dustfall," she said. "I wanted to collect Tommy and go home. I had a very clear picture of what my life was supposed to look like, and it did not include wintering in Texas or learning the names of 22 new students or whatever this is." She gestured slightly between them. "I am still not sure it should include any of those things. I have a sister and a school in Kansas." "I know," he said. "But I have been looking forward to every evening in this house since sometime in October," she said, "and I thought you should know that since you were honest with me." He did not say anything. He looked at her with the unguarded expression she had seen once before, over the natural history book, the one that was gone in an instant usually. This time it stayed. "I do not know what to do with that," he said. "Neither do I," she said honestly. "So I suppose we will have to figure it out." January in Dustfall was cold and still and very quiet. Cord Haverson was transferred to the county seat in early January, and his trial was set for the 3rd week of February. Cade rode to the county seat twice to give testimony and returned each time looking tired and slightly grim. And Olive met him on the porch each time, and he sat in the cold with her and told her what was happening. And she listened, and slowly, by increments so small they were barely measurable, something between them was being built. He withdrew the adoption petition on the 6th of January without ceremony, just came home one evening, and told her he had filed the withdrawal, and the judge had acknowledged it and it was done. "Thank you," she said. "It should not have required thanking," he said. "No," she agreed, "but thank you anyway." She had written to Ruth about Cade, because she could not write about him, and Ruth had the disconcerting habit of reading the spaces in her sister's letters and asking questions. She had written, "A man here has complicated my thinking in ways I was not expecting." Ruth had written back in her direct way, "Does he treat you well?" Olive had written, "Yes." Ruth had written, "Then let yourself think about it, Olive. You have been careful long enough." She had read that letter sitting on the porch of the Marshal's house in the January sun, and she had thought, perhaps Ruth was right. Perhaps she had been careful long enough. It was a Sunday afternoon in mid-January when she finally let herself say the thing fully, if only to herself. Tommy was napping. Mrs. Bauer had the day off. Cade was in the front room doing whatever it was he did on Sunday afternoons, which was generally reading or working through paperwork, or, occasionally, sitting entirely still in a way that she had come to recognize as his version of rest. She stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him read, and she thought, "I am in love with him." And the thought arrived not like a revelation but like a recognition, like finally naming something she had been looking at from the corner of her eye for months. The problem, of course, was what to do with it. She had a school in Kansas. He had a town in Texas. He had never said he loved her, only that he had not wanted her to leave. She did not know if he was even the kind of man who could imagine what a different life looked like. A life with a wife and a child and something softer inside the limestone walls of this house. She thought about asking him. She was not, generally, a person who waited for things to happen to her. But something held her back, some knowledge that the timing needed to be right, that they were still in the middle of something and the middle was not the place to make permanent decisions. February came. The trial came with it. Cord Haverson was convicted on 2 counts of murder, of which Marcus Osborne's death was one, and sentenced to hang. Cade brought the news home on a cold Tuesday evening, and Olive told Tommy, in the careful, simplified way she had been telling him the truth of things since September, that the man who had hurt his papa had been caught, and that the people in charge had decided what the right punishment was, and that he was safe. Tommy took this in with his characteristic gravity, holding the carved horse in both hands. "Is Papa still gone?" he said. "Yes, sweetheart," Olive said. "Papa is still gone. That does not change, but the danger is gone too." Tommy nodded as if checking something off a list inside his head. "Can we get a dog?" he said. Olive looked at Cade over the top of Tommy's head. Cade's expression for just a moment was as close to something like helpless amusement as she had seen it. "Yes," he said, "I expect we can." The execution of Cord Haverson was carried out at the county seat in early March, and Cade returned from it on a cold, bright morning with the particular closed quality of a man who had done a hard thing and filed it away. Olive did not ask him about it directly. She made coffee and put a plate on the table and sat across from him in the morning light, and after a while he said, "It is done." "I know," she said. "The Osborne name is clear," he said. "There is nothing following you north anymore." She looked at him. He was looking at the table. "Is that your way of telling me it is time for me to go?" she said. He looked up. "I am telling you that the reason I gave you for staying is gone. I am not telling you to go." "What are you telling me?" He was quiet for a long moment, and she could see the effort in it, the door being considered, the room behind it being examined. "I am telling you," he said slowly, "that I understand if you want to go back to Kansas. I understand that it is your life and your school and your sister. I would not ask you to give that up. I would not ask you to do anything you don't want to do." "What would you ask me?" she said. "If you were going to ask." He met her eyes. "To stay," he said, "to stay here, with Tommy and with me." "As what?" she said, because she was not going to let him be ambiguous about this. Not now. He stood up from the table. He was very tall in the morning light, and she looked up at him, and the expression on his face was the open, unguarded one, fully present this time, not going anywhere. "As my wife," he said, "if you would have me. I know I am not an easy proposition. I know this town is not Kansas, and I know I went about this in the worst possible way from the beginning. But I love you, Olive. I have loved you since probably October, and I have not known what to do with it except try not to make things worse than I had already made them." She stood up too, because she needed to be on her feet for this. "You are not an easy proposition," she said. "No. You are stubborn and you communicate by omission, and you made a very significant unilateral decision about my family. All true. I love you anyway," she said. "I have loved you since November, I think." The night with Tommy and the dark man. I think that was when I stopped pretending I could leave without it costing me something." He reached out and took her hand, and the gesture was so simple and so deliberate that it was somehow more significant than anything elaborate could have been. She looked at their hands and then at his face. "There are things to sort out," she said. "Kansas, the school, Ruth." "I know," he said. "We will sort them out." "Tommy is mine," she said. "Whatever else, Tommy is mine. Not legally, the petition is gone, but he is mine in every way that matters." "He is yours," Cade said. "He always was. I was just keeping him warm until you could figure out the rest." She laughed at that, a real laugh, surprised out of her. And the sound of it in the kitchen of the limestone house on that March morning was like something opening, like a window being raised in spring. He brought her hand up and pressed it briefly to his lips with the precise gravity of a man who meant every word of everything he had said. And she thought, looking at the morning light on his face, that perhaps the life you do not plan is sometimes the one you needed. Spring took its time arriving in dustfall. March was cold and fitful, alternating between days that hinted at warmth and nights that took it back. Olive wrote to Ruth, a long letter this time, the longest she had written in years, telling her everything. About Cade and the petition and the winter and the slow, careful building of something she had not expected. Ruth wrote back within the week, "Come home first. Bring the boy. Let me meet this man before you marry him." And then she added, "I am happy for you, Olive. You deserve someone who wanted to keep you close." The sentence hit Olive oddly, in a way she had to sit with for a day before she understood it. That was the secret at the heart of it, wasn't it? He had wanted to keep her close, and he had gone about it badly, and in the going about it, he had given her something she had not known she was missing. A winter in a place that was not her own. A town that had become, somewhere in the months without her noticing, hers too. A child who called her Aunt Livy with the absolute certainty of someone who has decided a person will stay. She taught through the end of the school year, which ran in dustfall until early April when the ranch families needed their children home for the spring work. On the last day of school, she gave each child a piece of hard candy and her best cursive alphabet, written out in her particular hand, and Bessie Crane hugged her around the waist and said she hoped she was coming back in September, and Olive said that she thought she would be. She went home to Kansas in late April, taking Tommy with her, on the stage that crossed the Cimarron without incident in the mild spring air. She had Tommy in her lap for part of the journey, and he looked out the window at the flat land going by and asked questions about everything. The birds and the grass and the clouds and the distant shapes of cattle, with the ceaseless interrogating energy of a 4-year-old who has recently discovered that the world is a great deal larger than he thought. Ruth's farm was green in the April light, and Ruth herself was standing at the fence when the stage passed. And when Olive climbed down with Tommy on her hip, her sister came through the gate and wrapped both of them in an embrace that lasted a long time. "He is wonderful," Ruth said, pulling back to look at Tommy properly. "He looks like Marcus." "He does," Olive said, and the grief of that was still there, familiar and present, not sharp anymore but permanent, the kind that becomes part of the landscape of a life rather than an emergency you are still surviving. Ruth met Cade 2 weeks later when he came north. It had been arranged without great drama. He had business in Kansas City, a court appearance related to the Haverson case's associated warrants, and had written to say he would stop in Holt on the way through. He arrived on a Thursday evening in early May, with a valise and a new hat that was slightly less battered than the one she had grown accustomed to. And Ruth opened the door and looked him over with the frank assessment of an older sister who has reserved judgment and intends to deliver it at a time of her choosing. "Mr. Ellison," Ruth said. "Mrs. Finley," Cade said. "Thank you for having me." Ruth looked at him for a moment longer. Then she stepped back and let him in. He stayed 3 days. Olive watched him with Ruth's husband Caleb, a solid, quiet man who farmed his land with patience and called his animals by name. And she watched them find, within the first afternoon, the common ground of men who work outdoors and understand the relationship between weather and livelihood. She watched him with Tommy, who had greeted him at the front door with both arms out, and the expression on Cade's face when he bent down and let Tommy climb him like a fence post was something she was going to keep for a long time. On the second evening, Ruth found Olive in the kitchen and said simply, "He loves you properly." "Yes," Olive said. "He looks at you when you are not looking, not in a watchful way, in a 'I cannot believe she is here' way." Olive was quiet for a moment. "I know." "Then stop waiting," Ruth said, with the cheerful directness Olive had loved and occasionally resented her entire life. "You have spent your whole life managing things carefully. Some things you are just supposed to have." She thought about that for the rest of the evening, and on the third morning, when Cade was preparing to leave for Kansas City, she walked with him to where his horse was waiting, and she said quietly, with the ease of something that had already been decided and was now just being spoken aloud, "Come back to Dustfall in June. We can marry in June, if that is still what you want." He turned. The May morning light was on his face. "It is still what I want," he said. "It is exactly what I want." They were married on the 15th of June, 1884, in the church at Dustfall, on a morning when the heat was already coming up off the limestone, and the crepe myrtle at the churchyard gate was in full flower. Mrs. Bauer had organized everything with the same authority she brought to pastry, and it showed. The church was not elaborate, but it was full, because Dustfall was the kind of town where people showed up for things. And Olive discovered that she had made more of a mark on the place than she realized over that winter, in the quiet way of teachers everywhere. Ruth had come south with Caleb and the children, a 2-day journey, and Ruth stood beside Olive at the front of the church and handed her the small bunch of wildflowers she had picked that morning from the field beyond the Marshal's house, because that was the kind of touch Ruth considered non-negotiable. Tommy stood beside Cade in a new shirt and the carved horse in his pocket, because he had refused categorically to leave it behind. The minister was a calm older man named Reverend Dodd, who had been in Dustfall since its founding and had seen a great deal. He said the words without rushing them, and Cade said his part of them looking straight at Olive with the full weight of his attention, which she had learned was how he expressed everything he felt, and she said her part looking straight back at him, and the ring he placed on her hand was a plain gold band that he had ordered from a jeweler in San Antonio, simple and good. Afterward, in the churchyard in the June sun, with Ruth's children running between the graves and Tommy riding Caleb's shoulders like a mountain climber, Mrs. Bauer produced a wedding cake of improbable size, and several people she did not yet know came to shake her hand and welcome her, and Cade stood beside her in the way he always stood, close enough to be present, not making a show of it, and she took his hand in the sun and felt the solidity of it, the permanence of it, the sense of having arrived at something she had been traveling toward without knowing it. Summer deepened and settled into the limestone house and transformed it. Olive did not redecorate in any dramatic way. She was not that kind of woman. But gradually, quietly, the house acquired her in the way houses do when someone genuine has moved into them. A new curtain here. The books rearranged to include hers among them. A kitchen garden begun at the south wall where there was good light. She went back to the school in September because she had said she would and because she wanted to. She arranged a proper schoolhouse bell system with the school board and added a basic geography lesson to the curriculum, because children in Dustfall had no particular sense of where Dustfall was in relation to the rest of the world, and she considered this remediable. Tommy started school that September, the youngest in the class, sitting in the front row with the carved horse inside his desk, and watching his Aunt Livy write letters on the chalkboard with the particular pride of a child who is connected to the teacher in a special way. She was firm with him about not receiving preferential treatment. He seemed to find this amusing. She was expecting their first child by October, which she discovered on a still morning in late September, and told Cade that evening while he was reading at the kitchen table, saying it plainly and watching his face change in the way his face only changed when something genuinely moved him, swiftly and entirely, like a current under the surface of a river reaching the top. He set the book down. He stood up. He crossed the kitchen and took her face in his hands and looked at her with the open, unguarded expression that she had first seen over a natural history book and had been seeing more and more often ever since. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you happy?" "Very well," she said. "Very happy." He kissed her, and it was the kind of kiss that contained a great deal, not just the immediate feeling but the entire weight of the year, the petition and the confrontation and the long, cold winter and the gradual opening of two very cautious people toward each other. And she thought that it was perhaps not the worst thing in the world to have been held close, even involuntarily, long enough to find out what was there. Their son was born in May of 1885, a large, loud, emphatic boy who arrived at 3 in the morning with a great deal of ceremony, and seemed immediately displeased with the world outside, and then immediately satisfied with it, in that rapid cycling way of newborns. They named him Joseph Marcus, the Joseph for Cade's younger brother who had died of fever in Missouri when Cade was 19, the Marcus for Olive's brother, whose face Tommy was already beginning to lose the precise shape of, and whom they both wanted to keep present in some named way. Tommy took his role as an older brother with the seriousness of a person who has thought about it for some time and has a plan. He brought Joseph toys that Joseph could not yet use and explained the workings of the household to the infant with great thoroughness, and the infant regarded him with the glazed equanimity of the very new. Cade was, as a father, exactly what Olive would have predicted once she knew him. Not effusive, not dramatically demonstrative, but present in the way that counted most reliably, consistently, showing up every day in the same fundamental way, so that the children knew without needing to be told that the architecture of the house held. She had known men who said they loved their families and treated them like furniture. Cade showed up in the way that made love visible through behavior rather than declaration, though he had grown considerably better at the declarations too over time. She still loved that about him. She still sometimes looked at him across a room, in the particular sidelong way of a woman who has chosen a person and finds the choice confirmed again and again by ordinary evidence, and felt a quiet, overwhelming gratitude for the whole unlikely series of events that had brought her to this kitchen, this life, this man. She wrote to Ruth every month. Ruth had a new baby too, another boy, and she said the farm was doing well, and that Caleb had bought another 20 acres, and that the spotted dog Tommy had been promised still existed and was, if anything, more spotted than before. Tommy visited the farm in the summer of 1886. Just Tommy, his first long journey on his own, taking the stage north with the understanding that Ruth and Caleb would deliver him back south in August. He came back sunburned and expansive, full of information about wheat farming and the spotted dog, which was named Cap, and Ruth's children, with whom he had apparently operated a small business selling fishing worms to visiting farmers, of which Ruth's letter provided a slightly exasperated corroboration. "He is entirely your brother's child, Olive said to Cade that night. He is entirely himself, Cade said, which was the right answer. Joseph, at 18 months, was walking with great determination and zero accuracy, careening from furniture to wall to floor with the cheerful resilience of a toddler who has not yet learned that falling hurts. He had Cade's dark gray eyes and Olive's wide forehead and a temperament all his own, sunny and implacable, the kind of child who would be easy and difficult in equal measure for entirely different reasons than anyone would predict. In September of 1886, Olive found out she was expecting again. She told Cade the same way she had told him the first time, plainly watching his face, and his face did the same thing it had done the first time, the swift current reaching the surface. "Are you well?" he said. "I am well," she said. "Are you glad?" "I am very glad," he said, with the directness he had grown better at over the years, the ease of a man who had practiced now at saying the true thing. Their daughter arrived in April of 1887, small and fierce and immediately obvious in her personality, which was the kind that assessed a room and then made a decision about it within approximately 30 seconds. They named her Clara Ruth, the Clara for Tommy's mother, the Ruth for Olive's sister, and when Olive wrote to tell Ruth about the name, Ruth's response arrived in record time. She was honored, and she was coming south to meet the baby, and she would not hear otherwise. Dustfall by 1887 was growing, slowly but steadily, the way Texas towns grew in those years. New families arriving each season, a second church being built, the school expanded to 2 rooms. Olive was still teaching, now with an assistant, a young woman from San Antonio named Miss Vega who was sharp and competent and wonderful with the older children. And together, they had organized the school well enough that the county board sent a representative to look at it as a model for the district, which Olive considered gratifying and Cade considered unsurprising. He was still Marshal. He would be for some years yet. It was a life that carried risk, and she would not pretend otherwise, not to herself and not to him. And there were nights when she lay awake listening to the house and the dark outside, and felt the cold thread of fear that ran beneath any life lived with someone who wore a badge in the territory. But she had learned, over the years, to hold that fear in its proper proportion, not to let it flatten everything else, to place it alongside the greater balance of days that were ordinary and good. Tommy turned 7 in the fall of 1886, and then 8, and then 9, growing with the steady acceleration of a child who has decided to be large and capable in the world, and the carved horse migrated from his pocket to his windowsill to the shelf in the front room where the books were, kept but not carried, which seemed to Olive like the appropriate evolution. He called Cade, eventually and gradually, the way these things happen without announcement, Pa. The first time it happened, Olive had been in the kitchen and heard it through the open window, Tommy's voice from the porch asking Pa whether they could ride out to the Harlan ranch on Saturday, because Jimmy Harlan had said there were wild turkeys in the south field. She had stood very still at the kitchen counter and listened. Cade had said, in his level way, "We can probably manage that." She had pressed her hand to her chest again, the way she had on the porch when he came back from Ridgeline, holding the feeling in place. Later that evening, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, she and Cade sat on the porch in the warm October night, the same porch, the same cottonwood, now considerably larger than it had been 7 years ago. "He called you Pa today," she said. "I know," Cade said. "How did that feel?" He was quiet for a moment. "Like something I did not expect to have," he said. "Like something I thought I had forfeited." She reached over and took his hand in the dark. "You did not forfeit it," she said. "You just took a very roundabout way of finding it." "A petition," he said, with the dry self-awareness she had come to love in him, the ability to see himself with some honesty. "A petition," she agreed. "I had terrible instincts in the beginning." "Your instincts were actually fine," she said. "Your execution needed work." He laughed, and she loved the sound of his laugh, still rare enough to be notable. And she leaned her head against his shoulder in the October dark and thought about all of it. The telegram in the schoolhouse, the stage south, the paper on the desk, the confrontation, the long winter, the slow turning of two careful people toward each other. She thought about what it meant that he had wanted to keep her close. She had been angry about it once. She was not angry about it anymore. She understood that the wanting had been the honest thing even when the method had been wrong, and that the difference between a betrayal and a beginning was often just time and the willingness of people to be honest about what they actually wanted. "I should not have liked you as quickly as I did," she said. "You hid it well." "I thought I hid it very well." "You did not," he said, and the warmth in his voice was everything. "You were completely transparent from approximately the second week of November." "That is outrageous," she said, and he laughed again. And the night was warm and the house was full and the children were sleeping behind the lit windows, Tommy and Joseph and Clara. And the cottonwood was large and settled and permanent above them. And Olive Ellison sat on her porch in Dustfall, Texas, in the October of 1890, and was, in the most complete and unequivocal way, happy. Not because things had been easy. They had not been easy. The grief for Marcus was still present, would always be present, folded into the life rather than resolved out of it. The years had brought difficulties she had not catalogued here. A hard drought in 1888 that had tested the whole territory. A fever that had gone through the school one winter and frightened her badly for 3 weeks before it passed. The ordinary difficulties of a marriage between two strong-willed people who both had opinions and expressed them, not always in the most efficient way. But Cade had been there for all of it. Steadily, consistently, in the way that was his nature, showing up every day as the same person she had chosen, and she had been there for all of it too. And Tommy was 9 and Joseph was 5 and Clara was 3 and the house was full and warm and entirely, wholly theirs. She thought about the school in Kansas, the life she had planned. She did not grieve for it. That life had been a good life and it would have remained a good life and she would have been fine in it. But fine was not this. Fine was not the specific and irreplaceable thing of a life that had surprised you into itself, that had been built from something that began wrong and became, through honesty and time and the willingness of two people to say the true thing to each other, entirely right. The stage from Ridgeline came through Dustfall on Friday mornings, and on a Friday morning in November of 1890, it delivered a letter from a schoolteacher in Kansas City who had heard about the Dustfall school model from the county board representative and wanted to correspond about curriculum. Olive wrote back at the kitchen table that afternoon with Tommy doing his arithmetic beside her and Joseph building an elaborate structure from blocks on the floor, and Clara explaining something at length to the carved horse, which she had commandeered from Tommy's shelf, and which had become, in her 3-year-old cosmology, a central character in a narrative Olive could not entirely follow. Cade came home at 6, as he generally did, and set his hat on the hook and looked at the room with the expression that she recognized as his version of contentment, taking a quiet inventory of everyone present, the old habit of a man whose work required constant vigilance and who had learned to keep that vigilance in its proper place and set it down at the door. "What is Clara doing?" he said. "I cannot fully tell," Olive said. "She is explaining the horse something about turkeys." "We saw wild turkeys south of the Harlan fence line today," Tommy said without looking up from his arithmetic. "I told her about it." "Ah," Cade said. He sat down at the table. Joseph abandoned the blocks and climbed into his lap with the certainty of a child who considers this a given rather than a request, and Cade settled his arm around the boy with the ease of long practice. Olive finished the letter to the Kansas City teacher and folded it for the morning's post, and looked at the kitchen table with the arithmetic and the blocks and her husband and her children, and thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that the best things in her life had come to her sideways. Not head-on, not as she had planned, but sideways, in the slant light of a season she had not expected to spend in a town she had not expected to love, reached by a roundabout and somewhat legally complicated route that she would, all things considered, not have changed for anything. "Supper in half an hour," she said. "I will set the table," Tommy said, putting away the arithmetic with the resigned efficiency of someone who has accepted his domestic responsibilities. "I will help," said Joseph. "You will drop everything," Tommy said. "I will help carefully," Joseph said with great dignity, and climbed down from Cade's lap. Olive caught Cade's eye across the table, and he looked back at her with the gray eyes and the still face and the warmth behind it that she had learned to read over years. And he reached across the table and touched her hand briefly, the same gesture as the first time, simple and deliberate and full of everything. "Half an hour," he said. "Half an hour," she said, and smiled and went to start the supper,